Well, hey howdy hey, it is I, Happy Texan 7, or as some of you like to call me, Happy. And, wow, case 1 is complete. I honestly never thought I would get this far. The amount of love and support I have received over these 2 years working on this series is just insane, and I can't wait to continue it with case 2. But before that, I thought I'd take a moment to look over this case as a whole and discuss how it came to be. Call this a retrospective of sorts. I'm gonna go episode by episode, pointing out some small details that you may have originally missed, as well as going over some fun facts and things that I probably would have done differently if I had planned this out a little better. Writing mystery is very difficult, but it's also a ton of fun, and I'm hoping breaking apart this case into tiny little bits is at least a little bit of fun. Of course, I will be going over the entire case, pointing out all of the hidden details, so if you'd still rather find them yourself, or if you haven't watched all 6 episodes, I really recommend doing that first before watching this video, as I am going to spoil the entire thing. Now, without further ado, let's start with episode 1, the Naybrook's Police Department. Now, I already did a pretty extensive recap of this episode in an earlier video, so I won't dwell on it too much here. Not only that, but I really don't want to watch this episode again. I can, however, point out some quick details and facts about this episode. This episode was created in about 7 months. I started it sometime in June of 2019, and it was released December 26th, 2019. This is the only episode I would ever consider rebooting due to the poor script writing and details I feel could have been fleshed out a little bit better with some improved animation. An example of this would be when the curtain flutters in the scene just after the opening. This is supposed to be a nail in the coffin moment for our killer. However, the moment is so quick and fast that viewers might not be able to tell what the hell that was supposed to be. I actually really appreciate theories because they give me a good idea on what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. When one of your key pieces of evidence, in this case the way the curtain moved, is never brought up in theories, kinda means you failed on your part. For those that don't know, I actually don't mind if people's theories are correct. In fact, I'm so proud when they are because it means I made a solvable case. The only time that I would be worried is if they were all correct and nobody fell for my red herrings. Speaking of red herrings, oh gee golly gee, Gracie, what are you doing with Poppy's things over there? Another reason I would reboot this episode is because of Poppy. Poppy was a last-minute character I added to this case because I thought there only being 2 forensics team members was a little weird, considering one of them was about to die. This of course left no room for Frank to also quit his job in the finale and become the detective he's always dreamed of being. Not only that, but I didn't want Frank to do the autopsy report on his dead friend, so Poppy was added to fill that void. However, I had already written the script from episode 1 before making this realization, and was now saddled with the problem of having to properly integrate her into the story. If I was smart, I would have just reworked the script to add her, but I'm not smart, so I guess gunwork prototype cameos will have to do. Oh, and in case you were wondering, Gracie was still going to be a thief before Poppy was added to the story. She was just going to be stealing things from Jane and not Poppy. One last fun fact about Poppy is that she was originally going to be kinda nerdy and shy as well, but I already had 2 awkward introverts in the forensics team, so I thought I would throw a little mad scientist there instead. I also wasn't sure if I wanted Poppy to be a boy or a girl at the time of her creation. I was planning on just seeing who could pull off the best Cockney accent and then making the decision for the character upon that. But then I heard Wolfie's audition and my mind was made up. Poppy would be German and Wolfie had to play her. Well, back to actual episode 1 stuff. Another subtle hint I had towards the killer was in this scene where Frank just outright explains how James attacks and restrains people.
You see, you know how you use your body to help restrain those that are bigger than you by wrapping them so they can't move?
And that's pretty much it for this episode. In conclusion, I do think it's the weakest of the 6 episodes by a long shot, and I really dislike that this is my opening statement in terms of content for this series. This episode is a mess, to put it bluntly, and maybe one day I will properly reboot it so I can make a better first impression, but for now all we can do is move on to episode 2. Episode 2 was the one I was most looking forward to when working on this project. I mean, it was the debut of my boy Danny. What could be better? Still funny to me that the title character isn't properly introduced until the middle of the 2nd episode, but whatever. I started working on this episode right after the release of the first one, and it took about 5 months to be released on June 30th, 2020. This was the first time I got Ghost to help me write the episodes, and he's been my co-writer ever since. How fitting for the voice actor of Danny to help write the episode where Danny appears. But we got a few details to cover before we get to him. This episode opens with our first Jane flashback, which was actually originally intended to be the only Jane flashback. Yeah, Jane was not supposed to appear again after episode 2, but I honestly just loved writing her, and I really wanted the audience to get to know her a bit more and her relationships with the other characters. I think this paints her as more of a tragic figure and adds to the drama and suspense as we ultimately learn who done it. After Jane's flashback, we get Poppy's autopsy report, which also has its fair share of issues. I don't remember why I thought the culprit stabbing the victim, pulling out the scalpel, and then stabbing it in the same location made sense, because I'll be honest, it doesn't make any sense. I have no idea how that tied into anything in the long run. I feel like I remember having some master plan about it with something Frank mentions later in this episode about how stabbing someone and leaving the weapon in the body actually holds the blood.
Oh, I can answer that. Because the scalpel was left in the body, it acted like a cork in the bottle, therefore stopping the blood flow.
Which is true, by the way. Then removing the scalpel, the blood then leaves the body. I just don't think this part made much sense in the way that it was presented in this case, and probably should have been planned out better on my part or scrapped altogether. Then we get to Scarlett's interrogation scene, which was going to be a lot shorter and have most of it go on in the background, but I was having fun with the scene because Scarlett versus Lynn is just too funny to me, so I extended it and gave it its own little bit. If you want to know why the language just went absolutely spiked during this scene, it was because this is when COPA laws had just first started, and I got a little scared in terms of getting marked for kids, so got a little bit of a potty mouth. A small little interesting detail in this scene is when Scarlett is giving her explanation of the events, Gracie mouths the word "what" when she's finished. I did this because I wanted to show that she wasn't totally buying her story either. Also Felipe. Enough said. After saying hi to Officer Perkins and Officer Campbell, we finally get to meet the main man himself, Mr. Daniel DeCamp. Danny. The only real fun fact I have about this scene is that for this line...
Oh my god, you are the cutest thing I've ever seen!
I told Ghost to say it like he's talking to his dog. He also hates that line. I do what I want. Danny's explanation style, for those that don't know, is heavily inspired from Herlock Sholmes' explanation style in The Great Ace Attorney, which, for those who are somehow unaware, is the main inspiration for the marvelous adventures of Danny DeCamp. It's also where I get my snazzy music you hear in the background. Also, it's now being localized, so on July 27th, go play it. This scene also used to be a lot more boring. Since this show is a murder mystery with a ton of explaining, I was worried the long, drawn-out monologues would be painful to sit through. And the original storyboard reflected that, as Danny was literally just talking to Frank back and forth. It sucked, and I'm so glad I changed it and gave Danny fourth wall-breaking witchcraft. Not only is it fun for me to animate, but I also think it's way more fun to watch since you're not just staring at a character talking for 10 minutes. Anyway, now our two protagonists have finally met, and they're on their way to solve a murder. But we gotta get rid of that pesky officer first. So, fun fact about this scene is that Danny was originally gonna talk to her and then run, and she was gonna give chase blowing her whistle or something, but that wasn't exciting enough for Happy, so sorry Officer Perkins, time to get shoved. This is actually also still in the original script, as this was a last minute change by me, and since at the time I was playing Officer Perkins, I just improv the line and stuck it in there. Jazz hands. Then this episode pretty much plays out from there with no major changes, except for the final shot of this picture of Jane and her sister, which was an early concept of Jin's character design. I changed it because drawing the reverse hair swoosh was actually very difficult for me, and I wasn't digging the red bow, so I changed it to purple, for no other reason than I like the color purple. And that was episode 2. All around, a way more solid episode than episode 1. And I think that's mostly thanks to Ghost and his amazing help with writing and acting in this episode, so send him some love. Yum, Scarlett's episode. This episode was the first one where we started getting some more clues on what the heck is actually going on in this case, shedding some more light on how things went down, with some very subtle ones as well. This episode started production right after episode 2, and took about 4 months to be released on November 6, 2020. I love working with my sister, and honestly, the support I've gotten from my family working on the series is just insane. Without them and their support, I honestly don't think I'd be where I am today, and it means the world to me to have them interested in some silly cartoon I make in my spare time. But anyway, on to episode analysis. This episode starts where the last one left off, when we finally get a little bit more details on what this whole ABS thing is.
What's the AB whatever?
It stands for Animal Above Surface. It's this group of animals with the goal of finding a way to the surface world.
Well, what's so bad about that?
Nothing, but rumors have started going around that ABS plans on conquering the surface world, rather than finding a way to assimilate into their culture peacefully.
And Danny has a headache that's totally not important until we are interrupted by the one and only Officer Perkins, no longer played by me, but by Silhouette. Perkins was also a character I did not expect to stick around the way she did. She only had one line in episode 1, and I didn't want to cast someone to say one line, so I was like, I'll just do it myself. Then episode 2 rolled around, and I thought it would be weird if nobody was watching the crime scene, so I put her back in there just to get pushed over. She was not intended to return after that moment, but I thought I could use her to characterize James a bit more, to show how much power and control he has to manipulate officers to do what he wants. I also thought it would be weird if she just disappeared after getting pushed down like that, so I think her returning was a good thing. I was also going to continue to play Officer Perkins in episode 3, however this scene ended up getting corrupted and losing all of my work, and I thought someone else could fit the role far better than I could, so Silhouette was kind enough to take over for me as Officer Perkins. This scene was very difficult for me to write because I wanted to have some subtle hints that James was the culprit, but I didn't want to make it too obvious so that everyone who saw the scene was like, oh yeah, it's totally him. I was very worried that him not having his monocle in the scene would be a dead giveaway, so I was banking on people thinking that I forgot it or something. We also have him reaching to adjust it because I think I'm funny. This was also the first time I gave James a lollipop because I thought, man, if this guy likes candy so much, I should probably make that a bit more apparent. So the candy snake gets candy. James's speech is also filled with subtle hints that he knows more than he's letting on.
Kind, loyal, and pure, with nothing to hide. But look around you, Herod. Everybody has demons, and everybody has secrets.
Oh yeah, everyone has secrets, huh, James? Huh?
I'm sorry, Frank, but sometimes our closest friends turn out to be our greatest enemies.
Yeah, our closest friends turn out to be our greatest enemies, oh golly gee.
However, I knew as soon as I saw this place that there would be no denying the truths we uncover here.
When exactly did you see this place, James? Didn't you just get here? When would you have the time to look this place over and think it was shady ABS stuff when you just got here, And then Danny knocks Frank's hat off as I cry, still not knowing how to draw a frog when a frog is my main character. This was just done so I could illustrate that all hats have pockets, as this is something unique to this world and needed to be established in order for the crime to make sense, as it paints everyone wearing a hat as a potential suspect. And James warns Frank not to trust Danny. Then we get to Scarlett's house, and if I have learned anything from my time watching crime shows like Psych and Sherlock, is that there's no punishment for breaking and entering if you are in a crime show. Please remember you are not in a crime show in real life, so you will get punished for creating B&Es. Here is where we also learn that Scarlett was in the ABS. This scene went through some major rewrites, as I was initially really struggling with this a bit. In fact, I had to hit the reset button and just start over a couple of times. As such, there are some small mistakes and inconsistencies from this scene that I forgot to fix. For example, in Scarlett's explanation of the events, she never states how long it took to get to her window, but then Frank in his debunking says,
Second, you said it took you 2 seconds to get to the window to witness the crime after hearing the scream.
This was something I forgot to add back in. One of the major issues I was having with this scene was Scarlett herself. For some reason, I just kept writing her way out of character, as I think at one point I had her having a full-on emotional breakdown with a not-so-great transition on why she's with the ABS in the first place. It was mucky, it was gross, and ultimately I'm glad I fixed it. I do wish I could have shed more light onto why Scarlett is in the ABS and what her position was, but it honestly wasn't that important to this case, and I couldn't think of any way to transition it nicely, so those books are all you're gonna get for now. Another thing about Scarlett is when I was first planning this case, she had absolutely zero reason to frame Randy. Like, she didn't even know him and she just framed him just cause. But then I realized that's dumb and she should probably have a reason for doing it. So I came up with the best and not at all most cliche reason imaginable. She was cheated on and wanted revenge. For those that don't know, Scarlett's character is the combination of my worst traits and my sister's worst traits, so her aggressive, sassy attitude is my sister, and her pettiness and stubbornness are me, to make one bitter character. After some parting words from Frank, that is actually the end of Scarlett's importance to this case, as we go see Gungal again. In this scene, I realized Poppy needed a reason for not being in episode 1. I thought this would be a grand opportunity to give her an alibi while foreshadowing further events to come. Also, Poppy may notice something about Danny, but that's not really important anyway. That's pretty much it for this episode in terms of things I can talk about, so moving swiftly along to my favorite episode of this case. Yeah, believe it or not, the almighty episode 5 is not my favorite of the 6. This one is. I just love Lynn and Randy so much as characters, so getting to write and animate them is always a blast. This episode took about 2 months to make, releasing in January 16th, 2021. Fun fact before I get into this episode, Randy is actually the hardest and easiest character for me to write at the same time. I love writing his pathetic whining and stupidity, but when he gets all flirty, I just can't. I'm not a very flirtatious person, so I often just sob in his cringy dialogue. But I guess that's kind of the point. It's supposed to be cringy. Anyway, this episode starts with Lynn with the scar on his face being more pronounced, 'cause reasons. Also, haha, Wingman Poppy makes me happy. This scene was the one I was most looking forward to in the show, Danny versus Lynn. Most of the scene was just me having fun with the animation, whether it be the stars around Danny, Lynn freaking the freak out, or, of course, Danny using Frank as a throwing star. Often in this show, I just put things in there that make me laugh, and I don't remember what made me think of Danny throwing Frank, but it made me laugh, so I left it in. Originally, this scene was going to end with Lynn returning back into the MBBD, and then Frank and Danny were going to have to sneak around in a little montage, trying to get back to the forensics lab. But I thought it would be weird for Lynn to not at least go look at the lab after Danny calls him out on it, so I changed it, even though that montage probably would have been pretty fun. Fun fact, that's actually why I originally put a crack in the wall right there, so that was another way that they could have gotten in without being spotted. Then we have walking and talking. I have one word for this scene. That's not a word? Whatever, I do what I want. That was a pain to animate. Oh well, can't be too mad, because as Danny says, angry makes you stupid, right, Lenny boy? Anyway, Danny gets to meet Jane, kinda. Also, there's a candy wrapper over there, but that's not important at all. Originally, I was gonna make that snake skin, but I thought it would be way more impactful for James's favorite thing, candy, to be his ultimate downfall. Oh hey, Gracie, what you doing? I'm so glad that people caught on to Gracie just ignoring Frank's question, as I also kind of wanted her to softly meet Danny before episode 5, as Danny challenges her about the bag, and Gracie tries to use her ditzy personality to avoid the question. Danny's not buying it though. For a couple of frames you can actually kind of see her other persona, but it's for less than a second, so I really didn't expect people to notice. Then Gracie says, alright, I'm gonna hit the emergency exit to this conversation, and we finally get to hang out with Randy. Randy's flashback used to be a lot less crazy, but Ghost suggested a series of unfortunate events that just kept building and building, and I just absolutely loved it. I also thought it illustrates how much of a dip Randy is. Then we have chalkboard shenanigans as we now go over our 3 main suspects. I tried to explain the reason why Poppy was not a suspect, as she had an alibi working with Price, but I feel like I should have mentioned this in episode 1, so that was a bit more clear. You know, she was a character then. Another thing I love to do is dangle secrets right in front of your face, and I do this twice here. One is a bit more obvious.
Snakes are pretty sneaky. You could be in a room with one and never even know.
And the other, I'll let you guys think about that one, since it has nothing to do with this case. Anyway, on to our big finale. Here it is, the big one. This episode took about 2 months and released on March 21st, 2021. This episode terrified me, mostly because there were so many different pieces to this one. In the previous episode, I kind of wanted to imply that they were going to confront Gracie as the culprit, especially when she reveals her other persona. I wanted it to be a sort of fake-out twist. Speaking of the Gracie scene, I just have to give mad props to Owl of the Galaxy, the voice actor for Gracie, who just went above and beyond what I wanted her to sound like during this scene. You're amazing. Here's also something fun that I'm not sure a lot of people noticed, but 2 of the most sus characters, James and Gracie, attempt to manipulate or gaslight Frank. James does this in episode 3 when he says not to trust Danny, because he can kinda tell that Danny is onto him and doesn't want Frank looking too deeply into this. Gracie does this in episode 5 when she says,
Frank, where did you find this guy? You know yourself I couldn't have taken the scalpel. We were together all day.
Gracie, I don't think you were. In fact, I think I distinctly remember a moment where you and Jane were alone together, actually. Frank actually notices that she's lying and actually lies to protect her as well. Danny knows that he's lying because Frank is a garbage liar, as proven in both episodes 3 and 4, with both Scarlett and Lynn not buying Frank's BS. Man, you look away, you look nervous, you're totally telling the truth, 100%. Another lie Gracie formulates is about Lynn in order to give her partner an alibi. In fact, Gracie's actually bluffing here when she says,
Well then, how about this, Mr. Decomp? Detective Lynn Yoster didn't even meet with Jane that night.
And how could you possibly know that?
Because, after I walked home with Frank, I had to stop by his place to hand off some paperwork on a different case, and I stayed there until the calling alarm went off. If you don't believe I am credible, you can just ask the neighbors. They'll say the same thing.
As if Danny and Frank were to ask the neighbors, they likely would have testified to never have seen her. Without Gracie lying for Lynn, he might have been another accidental accused party, as he was the last one who saw Jane alive at the time. But lucky for him, only one other person knew about that meeting, and that was his partner and best friend Gracie, who is willing to lie for him. Well, that was a fun scene about a bunch of liars. Now onto the big one. This scene was so hard to write! The first draft was just god-awful, and I ended up having to completely rework the scene like 3 different times. The main reason for that is because I wanted to make sure the order of events and evidence were explained in a cohesive manner, and also in chronological order. This was supposed to be Frank's moment, but I didn't want Danny to just say nothing because that's not in his character. I also did want to show a slight bit of subtle growth from Danny as he allows Frank to kind of take over as detective here. My favorite part in the scene is the most subtle detail ever that I don't think anyone will notice, so I'm just gonna explain it. In episode 4, Danny expresses how motive doesn't matter when it comes to solving cases. On the other hand, Frank exclaims how it is important, as he's constantly wondering why somebody would do this to Jane. What could their reason be? He does this when defending Lynn and Gracie, trying to show that they have no motive to do this, all while Danny is at the opposite end, only looking at the facts of the case and nothing else. Feelings aren't very helpful when solving cases to him. In this scene, they swap. Frank gives all the facts of the case on how it went down step by step, while Danny explains James' motives and how it ties into the ABS. I did this to kind of illustrate how Frank and Danny are starting to become a true team, as they come to understand one another's perspective. Of course, they still both have a lot of growing to do, as this is only the first case, but the steps are being taken. Then we have a beaten James who's gonna kill again in a fit of rage because he's a big baby who can't handle when he's lost. Then cut to Jane's death scene. This was a last-minute scene I added to this episode because I thought it would be interesting to show James's frustration and Jane's desperation. In all honesty, the situation could have been avoided if the characters were willing to talk to one another, but as in real life sometimes, we only hear what we want to hear rather than actually taking the time to listen. Then Kato shows up! Woo! It's funny because I remember the day I thought of how I wanted Kato's entrance to be, and I remember being so upset that he wouldn't appear until episode 5 because I thought it would take forever for me to get to him, but I'm so glad I decided to wait as I think his entrance turned out pretty cool. And he saves me from having to animate a fight scene, so that's always nice. Fun fact, this scene actually has the most characters I've had to animate at once. And then we just have sad. Just sad. I don't remember if I changed anything about this scene, I just know I love my dramatic irony, and I really wanted to show how guilty Lynn feels and why he's so angry and upset. Because in his mind, if he had just stayed a little longer, Jane would have still been okay. Okay, now that I'm done sobbing over Lynn, time to move on to the last episode, which is mostly just set up for Case 2. This episode took about 3 months and was released on June 18, 2021. So, for those that don't know, I planned on having 5 episodes in total for each case, but I ended up running out of time, so I added this one as a sort of epilogue to tie up some loose ends, and answer a couple of questions some people might have. So, Jen was Jane's previous partner, as they both worked in the NPPD together. I also thought it would be cute to show Jane and Lynn meeting, because I'm mean. Again, I love my dramatic irony, as I have Snake Man show her to the lab. Oh, another thing I love to do is have characters address one another differently. For example, Lynn calls everyone by their last name unless they mean a lot to him. This is why in episode 5, Danny says,
No wonder he called her Jane instead of Fincher. Found that a bit odd.
Poppy calls everyone Sir, enter last name here, or Lady, enter last name here. And James uses whatever. In this scene, James is trying to be respectful by calling her Dr. Fincher, but Jane doesn't like to be called that and corrects him, but throughout the show, he never changes how he addresses her. Frank, on the other hand, called her Dr. Fincher, and then when she corrected him, Frank corrected himself, showing Frank's consideration and love for Jane and her feelings. I just like little details like this, and I think they're so fun and cool. Anyway, now we finally get to talk to Mr. Kitty himself, whose name is Esteban Cato. For those that don't know, I put a lot of thought into the names for my characters. Some either have double meanings, such as James Lewis, don't trust a man with two first names, are puns, Poppy Barnes, Pop Goes the Weasel, or the names mean something. Esteban means all-knowing and all-powerful, and Cato also means powerful and has cat in it, so I thought it would be perfect. Esteban is also actually a last name and Cato is a first name, but I thought Cato Esteban sounded weird compared to Esteban Cato, so I swapped them. There's not too much I want to talk about in this scene, as most of it just hints to later events or possibilities, and I don't want to give that away just yet. Then Randy is finally released from prison. Woohoo! Originally, Randy was going to be very bitter and upset he didn't get more compensation for what he went through and end up hating the NBPD, but in all honesty, that was just so out of character for him, especially since Gracie is the one in charge of helping him out. I just couldn't imagine him going off on her like that, so funny Dapper Burger coupons instead. I also just thought this was way funnier. Then we get to say hi to Scarlet again. Scarlet basically fulfilled her purpose after episode 3, but I really wanted every person who was involved in this case to be in this episode, even if it's just for a little bit. So Scarlet tries to do the right thing and take back the testimony she gave. Don't worry, Randy definitely doesn't forgive her here. I just needed to get him out of this scene. In this next scene, I wanted to show Danny being sort of kind to Frank in his own way. He knows Frank wants to be a detective, and Danny believes in his abilities, but he also knows that Frank is normally the type of person not to take risks, and follows the rules to a T. So in his own snarky little way, Danny tries to give him some advice.
You gonna take that job and be content with being a forensics officer for the rest of your life?
I
mean, if that's what you choose to do, then shoot for the stars, I suppose, but if you want to do something a little more fun...
But before Frank can respond, Marcus! Marcus is more of a Case 2 character, but I thought it would be fun to show why the Guppy ship couldn't be canon, even though I cannot express enough how much I like that ship. Then we just have more sad. I knew for a fact I didn't want Gracie to end up becoming a forensics officer, as I just don't think I could see her in that position for very long at all. I also wanted to build on her relationship with Lynn, so I had her give up on her dream to become a forensics officer and stick to doing what she does best. And then the next scene is just entirely set up for Case 2, with Lynn taking 2 weeks off and watching Gracie's little brother Jackson. Well, I guess he didn't really take 2 weeks off, he was kind of forced to do that, but you know what I mean. Oh hey Jen, what's up? See what I did there? She bumped into him like Jane bumped into him all those years ago? Cause I think I'm funny. Also, haha, you can see the moment where she nicks his bracelet if you pay attention. Lynn does recognize her here, but he hasn't seen her in so long it kinda doesn't register to him. Gracie has never met Jen, though. Then Frank and Danny meet at Crossroads because, again, I think I'm funny. And oh look! Zach and Kate cameo! How fun! This scene was fun because of all the mini flashbacks, and now Poppy is Chief Forensics Investigator! Whoop whoop! And the case is wrapped up with Danny and Frank joining forces as private detectives. And there you have it, a deep dive into this case as a whole, with some little things you may not have noticed when watching. I allude to a lot more than what is explained in this video, but some of those things are for later cases that I probably shouldn't talk about just yet. I will say that I've alluded to all of the plot or things that will happen in every single case, that being cases 1 through 4, so a little bit of every case is in this case. All in all, this was my first time writing a mystery story, and although there are some things that I don't particularly like about this case, namely all the coincidences, such as Randy being the person who picked up the scalpel just so happened to be the only one to stumble upon the crime scene, and stuff like that, that I wish were just a little bit more planned out on my part. If you want to hear me go into a tad more detail about that, you can watch my Creator's Lightbulb podcast, where I talk about the whole case-building process. I also think it's kind of fun to watch this podcast now knowing who the killer is, and you can hear my constant struggle to talk about things without giving it away. But all in all, I'm so thrilled I was able to finish this, and I just want to thank you all so much for giving my weird show a chance. I know it's really different and silly compared to other animated series on the YouTube series space, so everyone that gave it a chance and stuck with me to the end, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. All of your feedback is greatly appreciated, and you guys are the reason I'm as productive as I am. So, one last time, thank you. Here's to case 2. Also, happy birthday, MFK!